Welcome to the Our Oakville podcast, where we discuss the importance of belonging in the place that you call home. These conversations are centered around a sense of belonging in the beautiful town of Oakville, Ontario, though the reflections and experiences shared are applicable across the globe.
Oakville, as we know it today, is rich in its history and modern traditions of many First Nations and Métis. We acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as being the rightful stewards and title holders of this land.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the podcast participants. Any content provided is of their opinion and may not reflect the opinions of the town of Oakville. Our Oakville is for Indigenous people. In this episode, guests share their experience living as an urban Indigenous person in Oakville and shares information on how we can improve the stories we share.
Hi, and welcome to our Oakville podcast. We are your hosts, Nabil Rahman and
Daniel Ridsdale, Community Development Specialist with the town of Oakville.
You know, June is many things. And one of the things we celebrate in June is National Indigenous History Month. And that is definitely something that is worth talking about in Oakville. And to talk about such an important topic, we have two fantastic guests with us here today. We have Julian Kingston from the museum, and we have Angela Bellegarde from a resident of Oakville. So Angela, why don't you share your wonderful personality with us and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Nabil and Daniel. Thank you very much for having me. As you said, my name is Angela Bellegarde, and I'm a band member of Papixi's First Nation, and that is in Treaty 4 of Southern Saskatchewan. I am Cree and Lakota mix, and settler. My mother is a settler. And yeah, I'm a registered status Indian, and I'm very happy to be here. I've been in Halton for about 15 years now. Basically, I grew up in the prairies, though, in Treaty 6 area, but I've been very pleased to be here in Treaty 22 area, and as I really have just learned, in a region that's covered by 5 treaties. So very complex and very interesting.
Definitely is very interesting, Angela. And to talk about more about Indigenous History Month and museums, we have Julian with us. So Julian, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Julian Kingston, and I take care of the Oakville Museum for the town of Oakville. I've been doing that since 2016, and it's an honor to have that job. And really, our mandate is to tell Oakville stories. And one of the things, and one of the reasons that I'm here is, the museum sits on Treaty 22 land. It couldn't be more Treaty 22 than where it is, really. And we haven't done any kind of job of talking about Indigenous stories and Indigenous histories. And so that is something that we are embarking on doing. It is actually built into our latest strategic plan. We made sure it got in there. It's in there a couple times, actually. And we've been taking steps towards doing that. And so my presence here today is really just kind of part of that process.
Oh, Jillian, I'm so happy to hear that. As I live here and learn more about Halton, it really is an interesting area that I don't think has yet been fully reflected in our organizations and our institutions here in Halton. And certainly when I first came here, I did recognize that. Just understanding how this area is covered and who has been here. And when we look to acknowledge traditional use and traditional peoples, it's absolutely fascinating, the number of people who have been here. And I really feel that Halton is an area that is very welcoming. Although I know that there's been traditional wars and territorial problems, but there's been a lot of people here. And I think that provides us an opportunity to tell many stories and to really reflect a history of Canada that is unique. So yeah, I'm very glad to hear that.
Thank you so much, Angela. For those of you who have been following some of the town's activities over this COVID-19 pandemic, you've probably noticed some of our virtual programs and activities have been diving a little bit more into our understanding of Indigenous culture and history. And I think this has really provided us with the opportunity to just dig in and try to really learn and present that information to the community. So we're actually presenting the podcast covering Indigenous History Month in 2 parts. So we'll have today's conversation, which we're very excited to have, and we'll also be extending another opportunity with Darren from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and anyone feel free to correct me, but I understand that they are the title holders of treaties in Halton. So we are really interested in gaining Darren's experience as what we know him to be as a bit of a historian. So he'll be able to provide a little bit of practical context around the history, whereas today I really want to get a better understanding of our sense of belonging that's currently being experienced here in Halton, Oakville, and the broader area as it relates to being, in Oakville's case, an urban Indigenous person. And Angela, I turn back to you so you've been here in Halton how many years?
About 16
About
years,
16?
yeah.
So how has that experience been, and do you feel like you have been able to establish belonging or a sense of identity as an urban Indigenous person here in Halton?
Thanks for the question. It's something I've reflected on for quite a while, having lived in parts of Canada, Calgary, and of course Saskatchewan, where not so much Calgary, but there certainly is an Indigenous presence there. You can go to Indigenous agencies, Indigenous events very readily. Satina is on the outskirts of Calgary, and there's certainly a history with the Satina there. But certainly on the prairies, I grew up as definitely an Indian, a First Nations person, an Aboriginal person, and you either are Indigenous or not when you're in Saskatoon. Here, much less opportunity to find your community as a urban Indian person. No agency, no tribal council, no urban reserve, which has led me think about, do we need one? What is that all about? What, as an urban Indigenous person in Halton, what is that community about? I've come to the terms that I really wish that there was something where we can, all Indigenous people in Halton can have at least a place or something to come together around, even if it's a professional association, to really be together. I had the privilege of being part of Hockey Cares, which was founded a few years ago, and it's a peer-to-peer exchange charity. And my son went up to Attawapiskat, a remote flying community, and played hockey and learned some of his traditional ways about hunting, and he was so excited to call home and talk about having moose stew and looking at these things. I'm like, well, that's what I grew up on, son, and he had a hard time understanding that because he's always lived urban. Those kids from Attawapiskat came down to Halton as well and got to experience what it's like to live here on a lake such as the Great Lake. Not the Attawapiskan Lake, but so that was one way where I met some Indigenous people. Other than that, not so much. So I found that very unique, very odd, and a bit of a challenge to who I am as an Indigenous person, and trying to remember that and to share that with my children who are so far away from their aunts and uncles and their elders who would give them that spiritual, cultural revitalization that I think is so important to their identity.
Right. Angela, I think you mentioned something that's really important, which is around space, right? When we're talking about belonging, we're talking about time and space. And the fact that currently right now there is maybe not a space specific to Indigenous organizations or Indigenous residents to sort of access like a learning lodge per se. How would you say that has impacted, or how can that impact an urban Indigenous person's sense of belonging in Oakville or in Halton?
Well, let's think about all the different types of Indigenous people that there are there. And when I say types, I don't mean tribal groupings. I just, I mean, if we think about it, and I'm not sure a lot of non-Indigenous people have thought about this, but if we think about, there's Indigenous people who have a strong connection to land and maybe their First Nation or their traditional territory. Urban Indigenous people may have that, tie still, and they go back and forth from community. And then there's a whole bunch of Indigenous people who have no ties at all. And that it has a lot to do, as we're learning through the Truth and Reconciliation process, to do with things like the 60 Scoop and residential schools. And so they have no ties, but they may want to learn more. And I think that's when you're thinking about belonging, having a physical construct like a healing lodge or a gathering place or a wellness lodge, I think that automatically is a place where that Indigenous people can go and belong and gather and learn more. So I think it's really important, and I know that there are some folks in Halton who are working really hard to make a physical community happen. And certainly when you are going back and forth from urban to rural split, those places are really a source of identity and who you are. But, we can also belong through community activities, not just institutions or physical constructs. So things like powwows, conferences in urban settings, those types of activities play a really big role in belonging. And I really haven't seen too much of that in Halton yet. So I think there's a real opportunity going forward, and as we live in an era of reconciliation, to look at those things from an organization and from a regional standpoint.
No, that's as you were speaking, I had memories of my childhood. So I think Nabil and I have chatted about this on the podcast. So my family is of Slovenian heritage, and when my family got here, my grandfather, when he got money, the first thing he did was to establish a Slovenian church, and then that attracted the community and a physical space around them to gather. And when there was enough members of the church and they all contributed, then he established Slovensky Park, which was like a trailer park and get-together where, again, there was that space of belonging where those folks could all be together. And as you're speaking, it just makes a lot of sense for me to understand that, if there's such a volume of a population, that certainly they would want to feel a sense of belonging by having a space to feel home in. And I try to think about my own identity of if enough action that was non-physical would be enough for me to establish that.
I appreciate those words. I always say that I'm going to pitch a teepee in the park across the street from me, and maybe that'll be the signal for all Indigenous people to come. And I know I'm in the land of the wigwam people, so that could we might have to do a couple constructs there. But I understand that wigwams are built often near water structures, as teepees. When we do settle, we try to settle, especially for the winter, near a water source. But down, especially near that beautiful museum, is water and a big park, and there might be an opportunity there, Julian.
We should talk, for sure. And if you don't mind jumping in for a second, just listening to Angela talk, it was bringing back memories for me. We were chatting a little bit before we started, and I mentioned that I grew up in southern Alberta, and as you were saying, very much a divide, right? You were Indian or you weren't, and like a lot of my I had a few Indian classmates, but not very many. And a lot of my contact was in terms of like going to the reserves to play hockey, right? We played a lot of hockey against each other. That was kind of what it was like. So that kind of brought it back to me as well, right? But even that was a long time ago now. You see the gray in my beard. It was a long time since I played hockey. And when I go back to some of those same places, it is less segregated than it was. I wouldn't say it's not like Toronto, right, where it's like a real kind of multicultural, melting pot, whatever you want to call it. But there's less division. I feel like there's less division than there used to be. And so that's, I guess I'll just kind of put that out there. I think for Oakville, from what you're talking about, or from Halton, for not really having a space to gather or like a community focus, I know from my own experience working with what was then called the Native Friendship Center on Spadina, like when I was back when I was at the Royal Ontario Museum, and that was a great contact for us, right? Because it was, I mean, we had curators that had long-standing established relationships and had built a lot of trust with a lot of communities, but we still very much relied on some of those like existing institutions when we were going out to do programming or do consultation or whatever it was, right? And that is something that I've felt here from like the Oakville Museum point of view, is there isn't that point of contact, there isn't that starting space. And so I'm feeling like we're really starting from scratch, and we've been able to do that, and we have held some very, I think, important first steps, but really kind of closed gatherings at the museum. And would like to work towards something that is like, obviously COVID is part of why they're not more open, but like when we get to the other side of what we were in now, it'd be great to be able to have something that was more of a public focus, more of a public gathering.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's so many things in what you're saying that I just would like to talk about. You know, first of all, we do know in Canada that there is a younger Indigenous population. They are moving into urban areas, and if we're going to be community that is reflective and inclusive, then certainly Indigenous people need to be part of that. And I know that Oakville, we're seeing those demographic shifts in a variety of cultures. So that is really important. So I'm really glad to hear what you say. And you know, what I've noticed here in Halton is that there is a pretty big split, you know, and in Oakville specifically, we fly the Mississauga's flag. There was a wampum exchange as well. So there is a start there, but a lot of people don't know what that means and the significance of those things. And so I think there's a real opportunity to really connect in with the Mississaugas and the Six Nations down the road to just understand better and to learn. People tend to come to me about the land acknowledgement and territorial announcements. And if you go on the Our Kids Network website, there's a whole section devoted to territorial announcements, how to do one, what to include, whose land this is. You know, people have no idea about that. So opportunity is there. And I always say, go to the Mississaugas. This is their land. We, out of respect, we must go and consult with them. And I know that you're looking to do that and expand your offerings at Oakville Museum. I want to just jump on hockey. I think that there is a whole big thing that you can do just around Indigenous people in hockey. And as we're coming into Indigenous History Month, I actually plan to do some kind of community message or blog on the importance of hockey in Indigenous communities. We've just had one of the first Indigenous hockey players pass away, Fred Sasakamoose. We know Bridget Laquette, who is our female Team Canada Olympian. There's just hockey. You know, I was going to bring a picture today of my father wearing his Lebret Indians hockey jacket, and how people go, you know, how people remember the dynasty of his residential school and their hockey prowess in the community. And in my house, I have, you know, my great uncle's hockey championship medallions, and just to remember, you know, that hockey played such a significant role in our communities. It was a way to get through residential school and be part of a team and have comrades. So I think there's a lot there you can do just with hockey.
You're probably right. And I'm trying to think if we ever won an away game on a reserve. I can't think of one.
Yeah, it's for some people, you know, I just talked about hockey cares and going up to Attawapiskat and how, you know, it was around hockey. It's just such an ongoing thing. So yeah, that would be fantastic.
You know, Angela, as you're talking and Julian mentioning hockey, and I think your mention of, like, you know, places where people can congregate, I'm really thinking about the role that recreation and culture plays in sort of enhancing that sense of belonging through hockey, for example, right? And this informal structure that brings people together to play a sport can be things that can bring communities, cultures together. And I often wonder why there's such a disconnect between the recognition that when we are talking about belonging, for groups that might not traditionally be represented as well as we would have liked them to be, why don't we start with the things that all of us enjoy doing? Things that can bring people together, things that are maybe leisure in nature, but through those processes and through those platforms, connection can build. I think even in our conversations, Angela, it's the informal nature of how we are connecting that builds relationship. And I'm just wondering is that something from your experience where, things don't always have to perhaps be so formal, that the informal nature of coming together and being intentional about it can really build relationships and help urban Indigenous residents belong in Oakville?
Nabil, I'm happy to take you out to the hockey rink anytime. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm down. Yes, 100%.
I didn't know that you could skate. This is great.
I cannot. I don't fall down. That's what I call it. So.
Well, that's half the battle there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the informality is really important. And, so sometimes I wonder, do we need our own institution? Do we, a friendship center or such? Or do we just need a gathering place, that place that is welcoming, like the lobby of the Oakville Museum? Is that a place where we can have Indigenous people come on a regular basis and just share food? Some of you will recall this fall we did a baking bannock segment, and just how there's so many similarities when we break bread together and just get together is so important, and talk in a very informal way. I think that's
an excellent point, right? I mean, so if we want to start with tea and bannock, let's do it. That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And because you have to have those kind of and this museums and cultural institutions in general are really guilty about, I have this agenda, I'm going to come to your community and I want you to do it for me, right? And right away, the reaction and the natural reaction would be, well, that's not my agenda. That's not what I need to do right now, right? And there's no, there hasn't been any kind of sense of community or trust built first, right? So, when I was making reference to curators and other museum people that I've worked with, you have to do all that work first. You have to build that relationship, that rapport, that sense of trust first before you try to dive into the other stuff, right? And that's kind of where we are in Oakville. We're in Halton in general. I think we're in the building relationship, getting to know you. What's the trust level part of it?
I couldn't agree more, and I'm going to bring that back to Truth and Reconciliation. And we are in a post-reconciliation era now. It's been coming on to 6 years since the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I look at truth and reconciliation as two separate things. Truth is hard, and that really is understanding the history and the context of Indigenous people in Canada. And I don't say Indigenous issues, it's the context, is understanding residential schools and the effect that has had on our Indigenous populations and where that has come. And it goes all the way back, to the Royal Proclamation and, now to the Indian Act. Truth is understanding that. And what I find in Oakville, in Halton Region, is people really want to know the truth. They get a little bit of information and they're either angry that they haven't learned about it before, they're personally shocked and are brought to tears by the atrocities that have happened, and many can relate because they've left their homeland to come to Canada and have this perception of Canada as being open and welcoming, so they're shocked. Some people outright deny that it happened, but I'm here to say I'm a fourth-generation residential school survivor, and I didn't go to residential school, but the intergenerational effects of residential school have affected me and my family. I don't know my language for a reason, and that was residential schools. So, they have to know the truth, and understanding truth means a bit of vulnerability on everybody's side, and that also then goes to the relationship aspect of what you're saying and trusting each other with that. The work that I do with Our Kids Network around Truth and Reconciliation, I always say, moves at the speed of relationship, and that means it moves at the speed of trust. And we really, as you're saying, Julian, need to build that and stop living two separate worlds. We know Indigenous people are everywhere. We're not just on reserve. We move in urban settings to rural settings across Canada now. So I really agree that we need to build that trust, build that relationship, and then we can look at reconciliation. And reconciliation is those calls to action, and I know that in our 94 calls to action there is some specific to museums and archives. Mm-hmm. That's a big thing. But it really does begin with trust and being open to learning. Sometimes I think I know enough about the non-Indigenous world. I really need you guys to learn more about my world, but and be more open to that. And I think that there's a great opportunity here in Oakville with our museums and other institutions to learn about that. So I really appreciate what you're saying.
So I don't know if this is a question, Angela, but we held a virtual program last week where we had a guest, an Indigenous professor from Queen's University, Dr. Mike Dockstader, and he was, providing us a little bit of context around, culture and communications around Canadian politics has really shaped the way that we unlearn Indigenous culture. And you had mentioned that, people in Oakville, Halton, they want the information, and I think there's sort of a duality there where, Oakville is called the community of contrast, right? Where people find it very hard to believe that we have, nearly 10% poverty rate, that we experience. I think there's over 22 public housing communities located throughout our community. These are things that people aren't necessarily aware of, and I think similarly to that there's likely, more Indigenous urban Indigenous residents or more who have an experience with or connection to the Indigenous community that they just don't share. And I think if we can do a better job by being the people who are sitting in this podcast of kind of telling those stories, I do agree that there is an underswell of interest and folks who are our neighbors who are curious and who would be willing to take, the appropriate actions, like even regarding like the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I believe that people would do it if they just sort of had the information, the knowledge, and the distribution of, how to actually respond to that information. I know in Oakville, you see our community centers or our community rooms have Indigenous names, and we possess this or try to take on this identity of having connection or relationship with Indigenous community, but how much are those stories really coming out, and how much are people actually emotionally reacting and doing what is called in those 94 recommendations to take those next steps? I don't doubt that people have the right intention to do so, but how much is that actually triggering the emotional response to action?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things that you're touching upon is the fact that there are some data gaps. We really don't know how many Indigenous people use our services, are living here in Oakville, or definitely in Halton Region proper itself. And I find that very interesting, why those data gaps exist. How come we aren't responding to necessarily our residents and who they are? I guess we have to also remember, as I started, there's a continuum of different kind of Indigenous people. Some who are living here and they have no connection to land. They know they are an Indigenous. They want to revitalize their culture and their knowledge. There's some people who just, it doesn't matter at all. But I think, we still need to have that opportunity for people to learn about themselves and their connections, and that is what has been missing, and hence the calls to action for our organizations to make sure that Indigenous people are reflected, because we're here and we're not going anywhere. And ultimately, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Royal People's Commission before that, and the calls to action to make sure that we build a better Canada for all. I'm not sure where to go with that there, Daniel.
I think, Angela, that was a really insightful answer to like a really complicated question, right? Because as Daniel's alluding to this notion that, and I think you alluded to yourself, that belonging, right? It has to do also with identity. And the identity of urban Indigenous residents in Oakville is not static or homogenous. That it's varied in terms of how people identify, how they choose to identify, what they know about their ancestry and their culture. And I find it really fascinating that, I've heard certain individuals are not comfortable identifying as Indigenous, right? Historical impacts of colonization. And so when we're talking about belonging, inevitably we're talking about identity. What do you think, Angela, can we as a community, we as a municipality, or just people who just want individuals to come together, do to break some of that stigma or make it easier for people to identify first? Because I think we can't jump to belonging without making a place for people to feel comfortable identifying. What are some of those challenges, and what are some opportunities that we can do as organizations to support people feeling comfortable enough to identify?
I always, this is a complex question and a complex answer, because at the end of the day, people are complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I'm sitting here I know my privilege that I bring to this conversation as an Indigenous person, and that is, I know who I am. I told you right off the top, I am a Cree Lakota mixed woman from Papixi's First Nation, from the Treaty 4 area. I know who I am. I'm also fairly well educated, and that is a privilege that a lot of people can't say. And I live a very middle-class life that I know that a lot of Indigenous people do. I know my privilege, and I make sure that I identify it, and I use that privilege to help other people understand who Indigenous people are in this world, but also to bring up and talk about and provide a platform for other Indigenous people to amplify their voices and tell their stories, if I can. So it's a very complex question, and it goes back to, we don't do blood quantum of identity here in Canada like they do in America. And I always say, if you feel you're an Indigenous person, you have some Indigenous heritage in you and connections, that doesn't make you any and you don't know it, it doesn't make you less Indigenous than me who can say that. But that's not everybody's belief. So, we have non-Indigenous people identifying who we are, and that is often through history, whether it's the Indian Act defining who is status and who isn't. Mm-hmm. We know at the time of treaty making that there was census and rolls, and if your brother and family were off working the trap line or off and not present at time of treaty, they may not be in that census and therefore does not have a treaty status. But you may. There's all these ways that we are divisive of ourselves and how the government has divided us, whether it's even the 60 Scoop, which we're learning more about, disenfranchisement, through a process of if the government deemed you well educated, or if you were a soldier, you got your status taken away from you. It's so complex, but we just need to accept people for who they are and how they identify themselves, not divide anybody, and just make sure that they feel comfortable. One of the things I say, and one of the things I don't see reflected in our organizations, is things like Indigenous art. Mm. I'm always looking for things in our institutions that make me feel safe as an Indigenous person. So if I see deliberate acts of art, if I see a land acknowledgement plaque, and these can be token things. I understand that. Token can be good or bad. But I know that somebody has taken the time to think about this and has put it up there. So it might be okay, and then I'll be a little bit more open. If I see even magazines that have an Indigenous publisher, then I know, okay, somebody's here, somebody's doing something about Indigenous. Those are small, simple ways. But I don't see a lot of Indigenous culture in various ways reflected in organizations. And to me, that is meaningful to me, to see those things in our
Right.
organizations.
And so if I just may, Angela, what I heard from you, which is really powerful, is that we have to recognize our privileges and our power and use that privilege and power, much like you are mentioning, to make a space that people can identify easier with. And I think that kind of leads me to ask you, Julian, that how can the content that we're sharing, I know as the Rec and Culture Department and the museum, we do lots of school programs. And so how can, even within those programming, can we embed those narratives of Indigenous identity that can make it easier for individuals to identify, regardless of how the affiliation of that individual is to identifying as Indigenous, but at least we're representing them in the content itself of some of our programs.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And actually, Angela made a whole bunch of good points too. And I think one of the things that we can do is to start out with acknowledging privilege, and then just let go of sometimes that fragility that comes along with it, right? And just realize that, hey, we're established. I'm using the royal we here, I guess. Like we're established. We're in the position of power. None of that's threatened, right? And so by being more inclusive, by acknowledging these truths, that's just a good thing, right? That's what we should be doing. So, I can think of a few examples. We have a restoration project on the site of the museum, and as part of that, we have to do archaeology, right? And because the way that works, and the museum sits on Treaty 22, and it's a designated archaeological site. We have monitors from the Haudenosaunee Development Institute. We have monitors from Six Nations, and we have monitors from the Mississauga that all attend and observe those excavations. All of the monitors ask me about our Indigenous collections, and all of them I have to say, okay, ours are terrible. Like, they're the worst kind. They're all like souvenirs that people went and brought back from on their vacation, then eventually donated to the museum, right? For the most part, that's what they are. And that's problematic, right? But for me, I can just call it out and say, yeah, we have a few things and they're all problematic, right? Making that admission is letting go some of that fragility, right? Or when it comes to programming, we have one of our more popular programs for grade 3 is literally called Early Settlers. That's literally the name of it, right? And it's named that because that's what it was called in the curriculum documents, right? So what we're doing is updating that, changing the name, and making sure that it has, like real, authentic Indigenous content that we will include through proper consultation. That's a process, and it takes a long time to do, but that's the direction that we need to move in.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're speaking about too, Julian, I've kind of had to confront. So, as community development specialists, Nabil and I are often programming, creating, and, just facilitating new programs in the town. And there's obviously for many people a concern around touching on Indigenous content or program facilitation because they don't really know the appropriate way to go about it. And we've been really fortunate throughout our kind of journey to try and promoting these types of activities is to have great guidance. And the one thing I would say that has been consistent through everyone we've talked to, and Angela, you were one of the first people we talked to about this regarding just, we wanted to do a short seminar on just guiding folks through how to do a land acknowledgement, is having intention and like communicating your intention throughout the process. And if your intention is good, your reception from the community or Indigenous folks has always been positive, right? If people know that you are making, a really respectful attempt to engage a population, and that your intentions are in the right place, regardless of if you're creating a new program or trying to pronounce maybe words that you're not familiar with, or guiding a land acknowledgement. If your intention is always consistently there, that you are trying to do something that's inclusive, that is opening up the circle to allowing more folks in, it has always been, at least my experience, and Angela, that was one of the first things you kind of shared with us about doing a land acknowledgement, is try to know which folks that you actually have to identify as the rightful landholders, and then bring something personal to it and make sure that it's intentional with how you're presenting that information. And I would say that's gone beyond just land acknowledgements, but also through programming and just really trying to enter this space, which has been just a wonderful experience for me as well, because I'm not afraid about doing this type of programming anymore or getting it wrong. I'm kind of more excited about what it can be for the community.
Well, I'm
for sure.
so glad to hear that. You listen to me when I talk to them. I know that you do. And I think that's the most important thing is those values that we all share typically, of respect and honesty and, just looking for mutual understanding. And I like how you say, open up the circle. We need to keep that circle strong. I never take an approach of blame. Why do you not know this? How come, you need to know this, you're Canadian. I get that we in Canada have not done a great job about teaching these issues, but the time is now. Our institutions need to heed those calls of action, and we can no longer live separate lives. It is incumbent upon every Canadian to understand the history of Indigenous people in this country. I find often that newcomers know more about Indigenous people in Canada than, Canadians who have been here 3-4 generations. It's stunning to me. And so I never come at this as blame. I always say that you have a responsibility. I get why you don't. I mean, I went to high school in my local area where my 4 reserves were, up the hill, and then right in close to town, there was 2 more. But we never learned about these things. I didn't have any Indigenous teachers in my high school, and we were Fort Capella is the center of Indigenous people in Treaty 4. So it's the time is now to do this, and if you take those steps with respect and honesty, good heavens, it took me a long time to learn how to say Haudenosaunee, and sometimes I'm still not sure if I say it right, but I do it because I want to show my respect and that I'm trying, and that's one of the great things I see here in Oakville is people want to know, and they're trying to learn. And when you approach these things, these issues, and you have these questions and you ask them, if I see you're asking them because you have a strong desire, I will tell you and I will share who I am and my history with you. And I will speak from my experiences as I am today. And I really appreciate us having this courageous conversation and taking steps together on this journey, because I think we all believe in Canada and we all want Canada to be a better place for future generations.
Absolutely. And just an anecdotal story to your comment about newcomers knowing a lot or more about Indigenous history than some of our native-born Canadians. So I'm obviously a first-generation immigrant. I came to Canada in '97. Living in Toronto, Mississauga, and Burlington for most of my life, I haven't come across many Indigenous people. And it's interesting, when I went to Calgary, I took a bus from Calgary to Edmonton. And I think on the bus itself, there were people who were visibly Indigenous, and the collection of those people on the bus were more, I had seen more people on a bus that were Indigenous than I had seen in the culmination of my time living in the GTA, which got me to thinking that I needed to know more, because I was astonished at the fact that how come I do not have an Indigenous friend in a very multicultural city. And so in university, I took a course called Race and Indigeneity. And I thought, little knowledge can be sometimes dangerous, right? You learn a little bit and you think you know everything. And I think that is so important and the reason I bring it up is the more we learn, especially as it relates to belonging, the more we need to continue learning and not think that we know it all. I think to Julian's point, he mentioned things like ownership, taking ownership over some of things that we have not done. I talked about, what Daniel mentioned about vulnerability, about being vulnerable enough to personalize a land acknowledgement and not simply read it. Angela, you talked about, the privilege and the power that we can leverage to make the change. And I think, the final point about belonging is that once we know, we need to continue learning and then utilize what we know in a way in which that can give other communities and our Indigenous, residents more voice. And I think that's really, really important because as Oakville becomes more diverse, we want to make sure that the voices of those who've been here before any of us are heard and are given that space. So thank you, Angela, for just bringing that to our attention. And maybe we can close with something that is interesting that we've had conversations around, Angela. I have heard a few times, you refer to yourself as an Indian, which is interesting because I too have referred to myself as an Indian. And I just wanted to ask you, what does being an Indian, what does that term mean to you? And I'm wondering if that's the same that it means to me.
Yeah, it's, and it's funny because I think it wasn't until just last week that I realized, yeah, you're an Indian too, Nabil. And we've been working together for a while now. And how it dawned on me when we were talking about Ramadan, I think, and Eid. So, I grew up talking about Indian issues. I did not grow up talking about Indigenous issues. And being an Indian to me means that I have a special relationship with the Crown. I'm not necessarily saying it's a good relationship, no value judgment there, but I do have a relationship with the Crown and with this country that is specific and unique than others. And, I am defined as an Indian by the Indian Act, and my children are defined as an Indian by an Indian Act. My mother, who, as I said, is a settler, she is an Indian. So, it means so many different things. And I think, as over time, we've seen a progression of that term, that's not really a term that we typically use in a public forum. I'll talk to my friends and family as Indians and the Indian way, and are you having Indian tacos tonight for supper? But we've gone to the term First Nation, and that's really what's identified in the Constitution. Aboriginal, the umbrella term encompassing First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis, three distinct populations. And now we're using the term Indigenous, which really is a reflection of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples globally. It's more of a global international term that is much more encompassing than all. So being an Indian to me really means that I belong to a First Nation, but I also belong to Canada. And with that, I have some inherent rights that every day I fight for. What does being an Indian mean to you, Nabil?
Yeah, I'm so reflecting on what you've shared, Angela, and obviously my mom is from India. And so being Indian meant that I belonged to a country in Asia, with 1 billion people and who are as diverse as the country that we live in today, with many different languages, many different faith groups. I find that interesting because the connotations are different, right? The cultures are different. But And I know that, Indigenous is a term that we need to be using moving forward. But in this idea of collective solidarity and a sense of belonging and collective identity, I'm wondering if what we have in common is just that term, can we champion it so that we can come together and share our voices, much like the way I asked you what it meant for you and you asked me what it means to me. If we can use that conversation, if we can use that engagement to really amplify the voice, right? To amplify the voice of the newcomer experience, but more importantly, amplify the voice of the Indigenous experience. And I think that's the whole focus of collective solidarity with individuals who've been underrepresented, stories, individuals whose stories haven't necessarily been told through mainstream education systems. And I think, to me, like that's what I think of when I'm thinking of the term, how it applies to myself and to you potentially. So I find that really interesting. And I think with that, I want to pass it on to Daniel of his thoughts and.
Sure. Yeah, I know we want to start bringing our conversation to a close, and I want to thank Julian and Angela for being here to have this conversation with us. Hopefully the first of many, if not in this platform, but in others, with many folks in the community. I hope that this conversation, if nothing else, maybe expanded the growth of one's public trust in another culture and community that lives right here in Halton. We've had the opportunity over the last several months to build a lot of relationships with different Indigenous community members, and it's really been a wonderful exercise for us. And I think if you're listening to this and you call Oakville or the greater Halton community home, just know that even though census says there's less than 2% Indigenous community population here in Oakville and Halton, there's certainly more. And from what we've learned, these are people that care much about the earth, about Mother Earth, and about ensuring that the land is protected for future generations in a way that maybe isn't being reflected now by our current way of life. And that's certainly something that I think we need. And as always, I believe that community dialogue and trust among our residents is something that we need and thrive on. A sense of community and a sense of belonging is something that will allow us to enjoy being in Oakville or being in Halton more and more each day as we can grow that public trust and community. So certainly I hope you walk away from this with a little bit more knowledge of our Indigenous brothers and sisters that share the land with us. I'd also encourage as the next step to just do some independent learning as well. Because this shouldn't be the only interaction you have with Indigenous culture. We spoke with one person about a variety of issues. There's certainly more that all of us can do in order to allow for Oakville to be a more accepting place. But I mean, Angela is our guest of honor today. I feel like she gets to have the last word today.
Oh, wow. Well, I would, just like to recognize Julian and really appreciate your openness and willingness to have this discussion and to really reflect on what Oakville Museum can do differently and everything that you're doing. I mean, I have lots of ideas now for us to have courageous conversations and to really see the museum as a place, as a gathering spot for Indigenous people. I'd like to thank both of you. This has really been a fantastic opportunity. Every time we talk, we seem to find something else in common and something to talk about. And I think it's really important, Daniel, I just want to pick up on this notion of sharing the land, because land is so important to Indigenous people, as water is. But that is why we need to have these conversations, because we all share the land. And I have, my people, Indigenous people, have shared this land for many years in different ways. And I know that as you guys are all settlers here, I think you have respected and are thankful for sharing the land, but it really is, let's share the land and make sure that it's taken care of for generations to come. And let's make sure that we're great stewards of the land going forward. So I'd like to say hi, and raise my hands in thanks for this, and in the language of the Ojibwe, Chi-miigwech.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you guys next time.